Okay, how's it going, everybody? So, today we're going to read the third chapter of this book, The First European Revolution, 1776 through 1815, by Norman Hampson. This is chapter 3. This is the French Revolution and the European Reaction. And so we've read these two earlier chapters, which was the political and social environment, and what's this other one? The intellectual climate. So we're going to read chapter 3 here. Let's see how long this chapter is. Quite a long chapter. But it's got a lot of pictures too. But anyway, we're gonna get into this. Let's go ahead. So this is the French Revolution and the European Reaction. In or about 1789, a number of things happened in France which struck educated men throughout Europe and America, whether they approved of them or not, as being of the greatest importance and of immediate relevance to mankind as a whole. The Germans, in particular, were inclined to regard these events as the most significant since the Reformation. From the time onwards, the origins and implications of the French Revolution have been matter for debate, but any explanation which fails to show why contemporaries responded with so much excitement has not explained very much. Until quite recently, there was a tendency, especially among a school of well-informed French historians, to see insignificance of the Revolution in broadly Marxist terms. Albert Sobel summed up this view when he wrote in 1962, quote, "The French Revolution, together with the Dutch and English revolutions of the 17th century, was the culmination of a long process of economic and social evolution, which has made the bourgeoisie the masters of the world." End quote. This approach has provided the stimulus for an impressive amount of historical inquiry that has added enormously to our knowledge of the period. By the very fact of doing so, however, it has revealed the limitations of the presuppositions on which it was based. Other writers, notably A.B. Coben and G.V. Taylor, have shown that there was no sharp distinction of economic interest between the nobility and those who, at the time, were described as, quote, bourgeois, end quote. As Taylor put it, quote, "There was between most of the nobility and the proprietary sector of the middle classes a continuity of investment forms and socio-economic values that made them economically a single group," end quote. If one looks at Napoleonic or early 19th century France, it is clear that the country was not controlled by an entrepreneurial middle class whose wealth and power were based on the new industrial techniques that had begun to transform British society. Moreover, a capitalist revolution that aligned France with Great Britain and the Netherlands would scarcely have been likely to excite opinion in either of those countries. Whereas, in fact, the Dutch were among the most enthusiastic imitators of the French Revolution. But if Coben and Taylor had performed a valuable service in challenging an orthodoxy that was increasingly out of harmony with the facts established by its own adherents, it is also true that both are in danger of explaining away not merely the emperor's clothes, but the emperor himself. If the revolution was not primarily a class struggle, they find it difficult to see what else it could have been. Taylor has suggested that, quote, "the revolutionary mentality was created by the crisis," end quote. Coben that, quote, "the revolution was a triumph for the conservative landowning classes," end quote. This scarcely explains why Wordsworth should have found it bliss in that dawn to be alive, or Goethe written after the Battle of Valmy in 1792. Quote, "Here and today begin a new age in the history of the world," end quote. In this predicament, it is perhaps helpful to concentrate on what contemporaries actually thought and said. To them, the revolution was the culmination of the various intellectual movements of the 18th century. It signified the coming of age of humanity, henceforth emancipated from blind superstitious acceptance of the order personified by priest and king, enshrined in birth and prescription. Man was henceforth free to create for himself the social and political conditions necessary for his own development. Since, as we have seen, the intellectual currents of the century were complicated and diverse, there were, from the start, different ways of interpreting what all its supporters agreed to be a movement of regeneration. The emancipation of the individual in his social context came to be identified, especially in France, with the passionate denial of that personal superiority, which our vocabulary still links with birth and such expressions as, quote, noble, villainous, or servile, end quote. To the homocentric mind of the 18th century, the precedence could be accorded only to personal distinction of mind or heart, or to the utility of the social function performed by individuals. From this point of view, and however economic interests may have overlapped, there is a very sharp distinction in the society of the Ancien Regime between the bourgeois and the gentilhomme. As Rivarol, a royalist journalist, observed in 1789, quote, in France, one is always either noble or commoner. There is no middle way, end quote. The Abbé Sieyès, in his famous pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, described, he called the privileged class as, quote, some horrible disease eating the living flesh on the body of some unfortunate man, end quote. The assertion of personal equality was the basic revolutionary issue of 1789. It was this which divided the three orders of French society when the Estates General met in May. The nobility had already made known their willingness to abandon their fiscal privileges. They and the commoners were agreed on the destruction of an absolute monarchy that Louis XVI had neither the will nor the means to preserve. At the Séance Royale of 23rd of June, when the king announced his own program of reform, he conceded all the basic foundations of constitutional government. But the first article of the royal proclamation read, quote, the king wills that the traditional distinction between the three orders of the state should be preserved in its entirety as an essential element of the constitution of his realm, end quote. Later clauses gave the nobility a veto over any modification of feudal and seigneurial property, the useful rights and honorary prerogatives of the first two orders, end quote. This was an issue that affected Frenchmen throughout the country. It generated passions comparable to those aroused by the question of racial equality in our own times. It was immediate relevance throughout continental Europe. On this basic issue, no compromise was possible. There were, however, a good many nobles who were prepared to resign their formal privileges and to accept educated commoners in all respects their equals. And it was men of this kind, such as Mirabeau, Lafayette, and Lement brothers, and Duport, who became the first leaders of the popular cause. Although this was not immediately obvious in 1789, the revolutionaries' repudiation of the traditional social hierarchy concealed a profound ambiguity, itself a rejection of former values. It could not appeal to any real or imagined past, and had to base its claims on universal principles. To the followers of the philosophers, who regarded education as both the means and the product of human emancipation, and to the disciples of the physiocrats, for whom the state was a kind of joint stock company in which all landowners held shares, all men were entitled to liberty and to the protection of enlightened laws. But only gentlemen of property possessed the education, the leisure, and the stake in the country that qualified them for an active part in the management of affairs. The constitutional monarchist, Malouet, who was one of the more lucid of the many exponents of this point of view, explained to his constituents in 1790, quote, a great people who refused to accept an hereditary nobility would have to submit to a class structure based on taxation, ability, and social function. It would have to confer on this hierarchy the full weight of the most esteemed distinction of the past, end quote. This attitude was to be increasingly challenged by a Rosier's school, which aspired to create a new moral order rather than promote wealth and education for their own sake. To such people, what mattered most was not assimilation of gentlemen with nobles, but the equality of all Frenchmen as moral citizens of the same nation-state. Such men were comparatively few in 1789, but Robespierre, even before his election to the Estates General, had already apostrophized Louis XVI in the following terms. Quote, the glory of winning for us the treasures of plenty, of adorning your reign with all the sparkle and pleasure of luxury. These achievements, which seem to common politicians the most admirable masterpieces of human wisdom, are certainly not the most important part of the mission entrusted to you by heaven and by your own soul. To lead men to happiness by virtue and to by legislation founded on the unchanging principles of universal morality, see beneath the imposing appearance of luxury and sham public affluence which dazzles the eyes of civil servants without moral principles. The enormous fortunes of a few citizens, founded on the ruin and misery of all rest, see above all the lowest class the most numerous of all, virtually driven by the excess of its poverty to forget its human dignity and the principles of morality until it comes to regard wealth as the first object of its veneration and its religion." End quote. The antithesis between these two revolutionary attitudes was largely obscured in 1789 by the common repudiation of the past. But there were already voices, not all of them noble ones, warning that democracy would allow the impoverished majority to use its political power in order to redistribute property. In December 1788, the princes of the blood warned the king that any successful attack on the privileged orders would lead to an assault on property in general. Malouet agreed that, quote, "the property owner desires first and foremost to preserve his property. He is therefore naturally inclined towards the respect and preservation of the rights of others. The man without property is primarily concerned to acquire some. He must therefore rely on his personal integrity to preserve him from all the temptations of personal interest." End quote. It is important to distinguish such attitudes from more recent theories of class conflict, which assume that irreconcilable conflicts of interest and values arise from the productive process itself. The revolutionaries were virtually unanimous in their belief in the existence of absolute and universal moral values and in common interests. In their eyes, the essential economic division was between those with some property and those with virtually none. They tended, in practice, to equate property with land and to postulate an identity of interest between landowners, great and small. The fear of expropriation by the landless of the loi agraire was largely a ghost of Roman antiquity, but it was none of the less real for all that. Once the revolution began, it quickly generated its own hatreds and fears, and its actual course was largely determined by material factors such as the state of the harvest, and from 1792 onwards by the progress of the war. The ambitions, interests, and fears of innumerable individuals pulled it in many conflicting directions, and the whole movement was one of labyrinthine complexity, which mocks any simple analyst. There can be no question here of even attempting to summarize the course of events. My intention in this chapter is, by concentrating on a single thread of the tangled skein, to situate the revolutionary struggles within the intellectual context of the 18th century. The king's stand at the Séance Royale conceded representative government but maintained the status quo so far as social privilege was concerned. Within a month, royal power had been decisively challenged by a number of revolts in most of the towns of France, of which that in Paris, and with its symbolic climax of the storming of the Bastille, which was the most dramatic and resounded throughout Europe. There was rejoicing in the streets of St. Petersburg when the news arrived, 3 weeks later. These revolts deprived Louis XVI of the power to arrest the revolution without a desperate appeal to civil war, and replaced a good many municipal oligarchs by men of marginally lower social status. But they left the structure of French society untouched. An agrarian revolt towards the end of July, reinforced by widespread rumors of marauding brigands, created the impression that the whole of the French countryside was up in arms, and presented the National Assembly with an unwelcome choice between inviting the king to restore order by force or embarking on far-reaching measures of social appeasement. The result was the remarkable evening session of the 4th of August of 1789, when the partisans of reform escaped from the dilemma that to abolish privilege was to lay sacrilegious hands on property, by inducing spokesmen of the privileged orders to offer up their particular rights and exemptions on the bonfire of national unity. Much has been written in denigration of this famous night. Even at the time, some of the deputies, such as Mirabeau, who stayed away, were inclined toward cynicism. Others, like the Marquis de Ferrières, when he came to write his memoirs in later years, considered that, quote, "a feeling of hatred, a blind thirst for vengeance, and not the desire for good, seemed to animate people's spirits." End quote. Reactions at the time were more enthusiastic. The deputy du Quesnoy wrote home, quote, "What a nation, what glory, what honor to be a Frenchman," end quote. In an unpublished letter to Cambassières, the Marquis de Saint-Maurice wrote on August 16th, quote, "Why do we talk of orders, privileges, and mandates imposed on some deputies by their electors? They exist no more. We are all French citizens, and in my eyes that is the finest title of all," end quote. As a result of the session, France indeed became a nation of citizens rather than a land entailed rights and particular privileges. Such seigneurial dues as could be regarded as payment for a previous transfer of land were admittedly retained, but all rights over persons, all privileges of rank and of civic provincial status, The banality of offices and church ties were abolished. In the summer of 1789, there was prevalent a spirit of optimism and fraternal participation in a great adventure that was to be destroyed by future violence, suspicion, and abuse. Even the conservative Malouet claimed to be a disciple of Rousseau, as well as of Locke, Montesquieu, and Hume. And his economic liberalism was tempered by an interventionist concern for the poor that looked backwards on the ancien regime and forwards to Robespierre. On the 3rd of August, worried lest the curtailment of luxury expenditure should lead to unemployment, he proposed a nationwide system of labor, exchanges, and offices of public assistance, as radical as anything that was emerged during the Terror. This he justified by economic arguments more suggestive of Keynes than of Adam Smith. Quote, all expenditure within the state whose object is to create employment and distribute food among the mass of the poor will be only a theoretical burden on the state, since it will effectively decrease both men and food supplies. End quote. Despite this favorable climate of opinion, there had already been a small but significant indication of the divisions that lay ahead. Towards the end of July, the Assembly debated whether it should open intercepted letters addressed to known counter-revolutionaries. Those who took an unconditional stand on the sanctity of individual rights insisted that the new order should break with one of the more unsavory practices of the old, and leave the letters unopened. Others, however, maintained that the safety of the revolution took precedence over the particular rights of the citizen, and, by implication, that the moral character of the revolutionary order justified its adopting practices that had been rightly stigmatized when adopted by the monarchy. The signs were already present that the choice between liberalism and what J.L. Talman had described as totalitarian democracy would be dictated by the severity of the pressures to which the revolution was subjected. The session of the 4th of August destroyed the ramshackle edifice of the ancien regime and declared its historical foundations to be irrelevant. The Assembly thereby gave itself the task of providing the country not merely with a political constitution, but with a completely new set of administrative, judicial, and eventually religious institutions that would be based on universal reason rather than on traditional French practice. And so doing it broke decisively with the organic school of political theorists, although it continued to lean heavily on Montesquieu, where the actual structure of the political constitution was concerned. On the whole, it was extraordinarily successful. Within 2 years, the institutional framework of France was completely transformed, and the new arrangements were in many cases to survive all the upheavals of the following century. Although the attitudes of the revolutionaries remained in many respects close to those of the ancien regime, they provided France with modern institutions which made her unique in Europe. By doing so, they refuted the argument of conservatives like Burke that a nation's development must owe more to its past than to the abstract principles of the existing generation. There was a wide measure of agreement among the revolutionaries as to the basic principles that should guide their work, the substitution of, quote, reason, end quote, for prescription, national uniformity, humanity, social equality, individualism, and confidence in the electoral process. Much of the Assembly's work therefore enjoyed general support. The old provinces were replaced by departments, most of which have retained their boundaries up to the present day. Each commune, district, and department elected its own officials. The department was the territorial unit in terms of which dioceses and law courts were reorganized. In place of the confusing palimpsest of the ancien regime, where religious, administrative, judicial, and fiscal areas bore little relationship to each other, and only a proliferating army of lawyers could trace their uncertain way through the jungle, there emerged a clear and logical pattern. The Assembly's universal outlook may be illustrated by the fact that, when it decided to do away with the old system of weights and measures, it invited the king to propose to George III the creation of a joint committee of the Académie des Sciences and the Royal Society, which should find a, quote, natural basis for the new units of measurement. Reforms such as the abolition of internal custom barriers, which French civil servants had been urging for a century without making any progress, were enacted with almost miraculous ease. Probably no assembly in Western Europe has ever achieved so much in so short a time. It was this practical achievement, as well as the principles behind it, which caught the imagination of educated opinion in France and throughout the continent. Swift and lasting transformation on the scale implied both psychological preparedness and a good deal of national agreement. It is perhaps here that the legacy of the Enlightenment is most evident. not so much in bringing about the revolution as in supplying a generally accepted program to men who found themselves leading a nation impatient for radical reform. On the whole, the Assembly tried to act for the entire community rather than for any particular section of it. Deputies thought in terms of universal principles which corresponded to what were then regarded as the economic facts of life. There was no intention to penalize, still less to expropriate any section of the community, and nobles who accepted the new order were frequently rewarded with electoral office. The first elected mayor of Bayeux, for example, was the bishop. Despite the extent of national agreement, opinions were divided on some issues of great importance, in a way that corresponded roughly to differences of emphasis between Rousseau and the philosophers. One of these was the question whether political rights should be identified with ownership of property. Discussion at the franchise brought out the opposition between the handful of Democrats and a majority which favored some restriction of the right to vote. A stiff property qualification was imposed on candidates for election to the Assembly, and the right to vote was itself restricted to those who paid a minimal amount of direct taxation. In practice, most of those disenfranchised would have been unlikely to vote in any case. And with something like one-half of the male population enfranchised, the French system was incomparably more democratic than any other in Europe. The present-day reader is likely to see in the Loi Chapelier of June 1791, which banned corporations, an indication of class bias on the part of the Assembly. This was not necessarily the case. Le Chapelier himself, when introducing his bill, provoked some dissent by arguing that French wage rates were too low. He seems quite sincerely to have regarded his measure as merely another blow against the corporate institutions of the ancien regime. This Rousseauist attitude perhaps explains why the deputies of the left showed no inclination to oppose his bill. More serious was the unrest in the countryside, which raised the disputed question of how far humanity should take precedence over the maintenance of order of the defense of property. The Assembly, true to its vocation as a defender of property, ordered the enforcement of those seigneurial dues which were assumed to have arisen from an initial transfer of land. In the absence of legal proof, the seigneur was given the benefit of the doubt, and while he could theoretically be bought out, the conditions imposed were beyond the pockets of the great majority of peasants. Disappointed by this restrictive interpretation of the Assembly's boasted abolition of feudalism, many peasants refused to pay. There seems also to have been a widespread tendency to profit from the weakening of the repressive power of government in order to default on the tax payments to the state. The deputies were divided in their opinions as to what should be done, but even the conservative majority hesitated to call for punitive measures that might make the Assembly unpopular and revive the executive power of the king. The result was a continuing state of insecurity in the countryside, indiscipline among the armed forces, and a steady increase in inflation, which in turn accentuated social tensions. Penal reform revealed the same conflict of priorities between concern for the individual and respect for the protection of society. A vigorous campaign for the abolition of the death penalty, in which Robespierre distinguished himself, failed to carry the majority. In the meantime, the enemies of the revolution were gaining in numbers and self-confidence. The ineffectual Louis XVI remained emotionally committed to the sanctity of tradition and of the social hierarchy, unable to accept the revolutionary transformation of his country as either legitimate or permanent. His obvious reservations impelled the Assembly in self-defense, to curtail royal power and to treat the king's ministers with suspicion. This in turn intensified the king's dislike of the revolution. Impatient of his inglorious and insincere acquiescence in what he was unable to prevent, his brothers and the princes of the blood escaped from France and tried to assemble an aristocratic army of liberation to just across the frontier. Artois, the king's younger brother, was particularly active in plotting royalist insurrections within France. Most of these were known to the deputies, and rumor magnified those which were merely suspected. It is impossible to understand the hesitations of the Assembly and the growing hatred felt towards the nobility as a whole, without bearing in mind this atmosphere of the Latin Civil War. Even more serious was the breach that developed between the Revolution and the Church. This was due not so much to the Assembly's decision to expropriate the enormous wealth of the clergy, in order to liquidate the national debt, as to civil constitution of the clergy, voted in 1790. The overwhelming majority in the deputies recognized the importance of religion in the life of the community, but they saw it through the eyes of the Enlightenment, as a kind of organization for public morality, not as a dogmatic system of belief. It seemed natural to them that the church should be reorganized along the same lines as local government, and the law within a departmental framework, and with the election of its, quote, officials, end quote. What they failed to appreciate in their concern for economy and efficiency was that the Roman Catholic Church, while in many respects similar to the other institutions of the ancient regime, rested in the last resort on something more than prescription and secular tradition. Faced by what they considered an intrusion of the secular power into matters spiritual, and denied the chance to discuss the situation in a national council, almost all the bishops and many of the lower clergy refused the oath to the civil constitution. The assembly tried to enforce a policy of religious toleration between the non-juring clergy and the new national church, but the Pope's eventual condemnation of civil constitution made the latter schismatical. In these circumstances, toleration foundered on popular violence. In parts of France, notably in the West, local opinion was overwhelmingly on the side of Rome. Elsewhere, it was the non-jurors who were persecuted, where the revolutionary clergy encountered opposition that turned against the revolution itself. Local authorities had to protect them. The result was to divide opinion everywhere, to provide counter-revolutionary forces with their first mass support, and eventually to drive the revolutionaries along the road that led through anti-clericalism and de-Christianization. By the end of 1791, both sides were turning to the idea of a limited international war as the only solution to the political deadlock. The king and queen hoped that a French invasion of Germany to disperse the armies of the Emigres would be promptly answered by the invasion of France and the restoration of royal authority, if possible by the troops of Marie Antoinette's brother, Leopold II, the Holy Roman Emperor. The leading revolutionary groups of the Legislative Assembly, whom historians have tended to describe by the convenient, if somewhat misleading name of Girondins, calculated that war would unite the majority of the nation in defense of the revolution, disperse its enemies, and force the king to capitulate or risk dethronement. What no one foresaw was that the war, declared on April 1792 against Austria and Prussia and extended to the Netherlands, Great Britain, and Spain, within a year, would transform every aspect of the revolution. The question of Salus Populi, latent since 1789, was revived in its most acute form. Since defeat would involve the restoration of the ancient regime and probable execution of the revolutionary leaders, the latter, with substantial support in the country, were committed to a policy of victory at any price. Their only hope of survival, with the royal army demoralized and most of its officers missing, if not actually serving on the other side, was to enlist mass support and rely on numbers until a new revolutionary army could be created. In practice, this involved dependence on the goodwill of the people, who were coming to be known as sans-culottes. The term was a vague one, indicating a combination of social status, social attitudes, and political conviction at the same time. The sans-culottes were urban artisans and shopkeepers who lacked the education and sophistication of the gentleman. Their needs were pressing, immediate, and practical. They were accustomed to violence and prone to seek prompt and forcible solutions to such problems as came their way. They had not read Adam Smith, and they would not have been less impressed by the elaborate theoretical constructions of economic liberalism, had they known of them, than by their own immediate needs. Much given to the social moralizing, they retained a belief in what has been described as, quote, the moral economy, end quote, of the 18th century, when its traditional restraints on the food trade in times of crisis and its interference with the operation of a market economy in order to protect the poor consumers. The sans-culottes never secured control over any of the main organs of revolutionary government, which remained in the hands of the educated, but from time to time they succeeded in imposing specific action of the kind they wanted. To some extent, the circumstances of the Revolutionary War themselves forced the government to accept as necessary measures of constraint that many sans-culottes considered to be desirable. Political liberalism was an inevitable casualty in a revolutionary regime, threatened by dangerous enemies at home and at war with most of Europe. The royalist press was silenced, and the law of suspects of September 1793 empowered the authorities to keep imprisoned men who they lacked the evidence to convict. Representatives on missions sent from assembly into the provinces dismissed elected officials and replaced them by the nominees of a dictatorial revolutionary minority. The demands of an unprecedented war effort for the Republic raised armies outnumbering the combined forces of its enemies. At the same time, it was building more ships of the line than Britain, implied some form of conscription, the direction of labor, and the requisiting of war materials. Financing this war effort without catastrophic inflation involved an attempt to control wages and the price of necessities, which in turn meant the requisitioning of food and the tracking down of black marketeers. To secure peasant support, all seigneurial dues were finally abolished, without compensation, in 1793. It's a really cool picture with ships in this book. Okay. These measures were extremely distasteful to the economic liberalism of the great majority of the deputies. A resolute minority, known as the Montagnards, were prepared to accept and justify such action as they believed necessary or were unable to prevent, such as the prison massacres of September 1792 that seemed to their sans-culotte perpetrators a legitimate way of disposing of enemies of the revolution. The majority of the convention, the new assembly elected in the same month, after an armed attack on the Tuileries, had overthrown the monarchy on the 10th of August, gave its silent endorsement to whatever seemed necessary for victory. The Girondins, alarmed by the violence in Paris, which their enemies had tried to turn against them, set themselves the impossible task of supporting the war and, indeed, of extending it, while at the same time preaching the virtues of liberalism and attacking the, quote, anarchists, end quote. Having monopolized most of the leading positions in the revolutionary government, the Girondins were blamed for the disastrous turn which events took in the spring of 1793. France was invaded on every frontier. Dumouriez, her most successful general, after failing to turn his army against Paris, deserted to the Austrians. A major civil war broke out in Vendée. After weeks of rising tension in Paris, a popular demonstration on the 2nd of June 1793 forced the reluctant convention to agree to the arrest of Girondin leaders. The Montagnards then took control of a republic that seemed on the brink of defeat and dissolution. Their attempt to combine military efficiency with political moderation was started by further military reverses, an extension of the Civil War to some of the main cities of southern France, and the Revolt of Toulon, which handed over almost half of the French fleet to Admiral Hood. In the autumn of 1793, the Montagnards were forced back on a policy of spontaneous terror, which involved unleashing all those who still clung to the revolution. Try to pull this in closer. In a desperate effort to intimidate domestic enemies and drive the armies forward to victory, the military tide quickly turned, but the government was left to face the anarchy which it had tolerated, if not actually conjured up, in the provinces. Towns raised their own revolutionary armies to compete with each other in requisitioning food. The mitraillades of Lyons and the noyades of Nantes inflated repression to nightmarish proportions, and a dechristianizing movement, perhaps begun as a political maneuver in Paris, was enthusiastically taken up by sans-culottes, who closed churches all over the country and bullied many of the clergy into abjuring. The Committee of Public Safety, a committee of 12 deputies, which was gradually acquiring the status and authority of a war cabinet, then began to reassert the authority of the central government. As the military situation continued to improve, the most likely evolution of the political situation was towards a gradual return to moderate constitutional government. This seems to have been the intention of Danton, who was not himself a member of the Committee of Public Safety, and may for a time have been that of Robespierre and Saint-Just in 1794, however, the committee began to move in a different direction. Robespierre, as most prominent theorist, had throughout the revolution opposed Rousseau's ethics to the enlightened utilitarianism of the majority of the deputies, perhaps fantasized by the extreme pressures to which the whole committee was subjected and by continued counter-revolutionary intrigue. He seems to have become convinced that he had a personal mission to force France into the paths of Rousseau's virtue. But Robespierre was no personal dictator, even with the help of his political allies, Saint-Just and Couthon. He did not control the Committee of Public Safety. The Rousseauist policy, with which his name is linked, would have never made even the limited headway it did if it had not enjoyed some support from colleagues on the committee such as Barré, Billiard, Varin, and Carnot. It struck up some response from the floor of the convention. The new policy aspired to raise France to the level of Rousseau's idealized Sparta. Quote, monarchy does not lie in the kingship, end quote. And said Saint-Just, quote, it means crime. The republic does not reside in a senate, it means virtue, end quote. Virtue, in the classical sense of the subordination of the individual to the citizen, took precedence over all other human values. Even over democracy itself, the uneducated masses, while preserved from the corruption of wealth and a living example to the more fortunate, were at the same time regarded as infinitely gullible, by reason of their very innocence, and whether they admitted the fact or not, in need of protection from the unscrupulous. Robespierre combined in the exaltation of the fanatic with a shrewd sense of political realities, and one must beware of disassociating the abstractions in which he often chose to express himself from their day-to-day context. When he reproved the wives of imprisoned suspects for petitioning the assembly in favor of their husbands, with the chilly observation that Republicans should forget that they were wives and remember only that they were citizens, he may well have been right in thinking that the unfortunate women were being manipulated by his political opponents. But his Rousseauist language was much more than the window dressing of a political opportunist. His creed was summed up in his long speech of the 7th of May, 1794. Quote, on the relationship between religious and moral ideas and republican principles, end quote, which is directed as much against the materialist determination of the philosophers as against the political opponents of the revolution. He began with Rousseauist arguments that, quote, the peoples of Europe have made astonishing progress in what are known as the arts and sciences, while they seem ignorant of the first elements of public morality, end quote. He went on to examine what he called, quote, the preface to our revolution, end quote, namely the Enlightenment, contrasting the hypocrisy of materialists who based their theories on egoism, with Rousseau, quote, the tutor of the human race, end quote. He attributed the positive achievements of the revolution to the, quote, common sense without intrigue and genius without instruction, end quote, of ordinary people, and claimed that the intellectuals had often been wrong, while artisans and peasants had shown a better grasp of fundamentals. The main point of his speech was to insist on the political necessity for a civic religion that would unite Republicans and reinforce their vulnerable virtue. But although he thought it expedient to justify the new cult of the Supreme Being on grounds of moral utilitarianism, there could be little doubt that it corresponded to a private belief that he held with passionate conviction. Paraphrasing Rousseau's Vicaire Savoyard, Robespierre asserted that the particular intelligence of every man, led astray by his passions, is often a mere sophist, pleading the cause of those very passions, and human authority can always be rebutted by human vanity. The only thing can produce or take the place of that precious instinct which makes up for the inadequacy of human authority is religious feeling, which impresses on men's soul the idea of a superhuman sanction lying behind the precepts of morality. Robespierre's attack on materialism was supported by Carnot. Quote, to deny the Supreme Being is to deny the existence of nature itself, end quote. And by Couthon, who preached to the Jacobins the kind of sermon that must formerly have issued from many a pulpit, anathematizing the philosophers. Quote, where are those pseudo-philosophers who lie to themselves so impudently in denying the existence of God? The answer, as his audience well knew, was that the Committee of Public Safety had just had them executed. Quote, did they or their like produce all those wonders that we admire without comprehending? Did they create the course of the seasons of the stars? Although none of those concerned might have cared to admit it, The Committee of Public Safety was both recalling the early 18th century devotees of a Christian providence and anticipating Wordsworth and the nature philosophers of Germany. Hitherto Robespierre and his allies had tended to take the principles of economic liberalism for granted, while they concentrated their attention on higher things and betrayed their occasional irritation at the sans-culottes, preoccupation with the standard of living, quote, paltry merchandise, end quote, as Robespierre called it. They had accepted without enthusiasm the political necessity for price controls. In the spring of 1794, however, they began groping towards a moral and political solution to economic problems. Quote, we must moralize trade, end quote, said Robespierre, thinking in terms of limited profit margins, enforced and also guaranteed by the state. Saint Just, who in his private reflections denounced wealth as infamous, declared to the convention that, quote, la force des choses was imposing new economic attitudes. Since wealth implied power, and specifically power to corrupt, it could not be left in the hands of the known enemies of the Republic. Arguments of this kind have been quoted as evidence that the revolution was moving in the direction of socialism. There was indeed something new in the assertion that political power should be used to effect a transfer of property in the interest of the poor. But one scarcely needs to insist on the fact that the moral economy of the Robespierres, with its suspicion of all wealth, idealization of humble independence, and indifference to technological progress, was very far from later socialists. Emphasis on the social ownership of the means of production as the key of exploitation of the Industrial Revolution and the material interests of the proletariat. In contemporary terms, however, the Robespierre's inclination to treat property not as an abstract right but as a social institution generated the same kind of enthusiasm in some and alarm in others that was to greet later socialist movements. No Rousseauists could forget Emilie, and the Robespierres pinned their long-term hopes on the effects of education and republican institutions in molding for its citizens. Saint Just confided to his notebook that it was for the legislator to transform people into the kind of men he wanted them to become. Robespierre said publicly that, quote, the nation alone has the right to bring up its children. We cannot confide this trust to family pride and individual prejudice, end quote. The revolutionaries had been arguing about education since 1792. Broadly speaking, liberals such as Condorcet stressed the dissemination of knowledge, independently of any political indoctrination, while the Rousseauists put the emphasis on civic morality, which proved strangely similar to the athletic, patriotic, and religious values of Arnold's rugby, and on a state monopoly of education. The education bill, which Robespierre read to the convention in July 1793, provided for the free and compulsory education of all boys and girls in 25,000 boarding schools. The Assembly, however, was continually changing its mind, and the bill adopted at the end of the year was a good deal more liberal. The question was academic in more ways than one, since virtually nothing was achieved in practice. Were education broadened into esprit public? The regime was active in protecting the sovereign people from its own fallibility. The threat of the Revolutionary Tribunal enforced a tight censorship on books and periodicals. The theater was largely given over to propaganda, and the moral order set prostitutes as well as royalists underground. So far as most people were concerned, the dictatorship of virtue was most obvious and most dangerous. Where it impinged on the law. In theory, the regime subscribed to the kind of attitude that was later to be associated with the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat. It was to be benign towards the people, but merciless to its enemies. Barrère explained that true humanity consisted in exterminating the enemies of humanity. Since, as Robespierre put it, quote, whatever is immoral is impolitic, whatever is corrupting is counter-revolutionary, end quote. Formal proof of a specific charge was less important than the moral certainty that the accused belonged either to the elect or the damned. The law of the 10th of June, 1794, which introduced the final and most bloody stage of the terror, drew the logical conclusion. Quote, if material or moral proof exists independently of the evidence of witnesses, the latter will not be heard unless this formality should appear necessary, either to discover accomplices, or for other important reasons concerning the public interest." End quote. In a curious way, this anticipated the argument of a fanatical counter-revolutionary, the Maistre, that a man wrongly convicted on one charge was probably guilty of others, or he would not have been accused in the first place. The extremism of the latter-day Rousseauist saints, and there was an element of sanctity in the disinterested single-mindedness of the finest of them, was never shared by more than a small minority of the deputies. When divisions within the Committee of Public Safety led to the overthrow and execution of Robespierre's group in July 1794, the majority tried to return to liberalism. The terror was speedily wound up. The prisons opened, and during the winter of 1794-95, those of the Girondins who had survived resumed their seats in the convention. The Assembly set to work to draft a new constitution that should preserve France from both royalists and sans-culottes. Moral democracy was now discredited by the terror, and the prevailing mood was that expressed by Boisy d'Angles. Quote, "We must be ruled by the best. The best are those with most education, who are most concerned with the preservation of the laws. A country ruled by property owners is, in the ordre social, one in which men without property govern is in a state of nature." End quote. In a sense, this was a return to the spirit of 1789. But the optimism and benevolence of 1789 had given way to suspicion and fear. The new constitution still offered a vote to anyone who paid direct taxes. But the electors, who actually chose the deputies, had to be substantial property owners. The new attitudes were sharply emphasized in the spring of 1795, when 2 hunger riots of Parisian sans-culottes were forcibly repressed. The last flicker of Rousseauist radicalism seemed to have been extinguished when Babeuf's conspiracy was suppressed in the following year. Virtue was now at a discount in every sense of that ambiguous word. War contractors and speculators of every kind dominated the social life of the capital. In this nouveau riche world, revolutionary standards of morality went by the board. Sexual license was paraded with ostentation. Fashion conformed to the new extravagance, and the transparency of women's dresses symbolized the passing of the sans-culottes in more ways than one. Historians have been so conscious of the abrupt descent from the heights of Spartan civisme that they have sometimes tended to overlook the extent to which the Directory of 1795 through 99 remained a revolutionary regime. France was still a republic, with the widest franchise in Europe, dedicated to the new gods of the Enlightenment. If primary education was somewhat neglected, state secondary schools were created that were to be prototypes of the lycées. Science and technology were particularly favored at the Institute, which replaced the Royal Academies, and a number of institutions for advanced technological study. There's quite a few pictures in here. I like to stop and look at them. When Bonaparte sailed for Egypt in May 1798, he took with him a remarkable group of 165 scientists, whose work was to have far more lasting significance than the military expedition. The Directory also gave its support to the anti-Christian attitudes of the Enlightenment. Church and state were officially separated in 1794, before the Directory actually came into being, but it continued the policy by which Roman Catholicism was tolerated but discouraged. The old religion was challenged by the new cult of Theophilanthropy, and by the state-sponsored Culte de Caer, a state religion which continued some of the aspects of both the worship of reason and that of the Supreme Being. By the standards of contemporary Europe, France, with its repudiation of divine right, tradition, and Christianity, was still revolutionary. Even the restored sanctity of property was anything but reassuring to the European nobility, since a good deal of the property in question consisted of the confiscated estates of clergy and emigrants, and specifically excluded all forms of seigneurial rights. Victorious abroad and a threat to the traditional order of the whole of Europe, France was in danger of sinking into anarchy at home. The extraordinary war effort, combined with the partial breakdown of the fiscal machine, plunged the country into runaway inflation as soon as the economic controls and the terror which enforced them were disbanded. The revolutionary paper currency became valueless and was replaced. When inflation and a market economy threatened to starve the towns, controls had to be reimposed on a local ad hoc basis that was often more oppressive than anything that had gone before. Over large parts of the countryside, law and order had broken down. Royalist murder gangs maintained a counter-terror in the South in 1794 through 95. Over considerable areas of the West, Royalist Catholics, deserters from the army, and common brigands murdered the officials of the Republic with impunity, intimidated the countryside, and raided the towns. In Paris, the political regime reflected the bitter divisions of the country as a whole. Moderate politicians were split on the question of restoring the monarchy, for the émigré Louis XVIII would have no truck with constitutions. Elections tended to be won by royalists or Jacobins, both hostile to the government, as well as to each other. With the country in a permanent state of civil war, moderate policies could be imposed only by force. And from 1797 onwards, the government was periodically obliged to call in the army to purge the assembly. It was probably only a matter of time before an ambitious general should set up in business for himself. Sieyès was busy plotting the revision of the Constitution by a coup d'état, for which he needed military support, when Bonaparte returned from Egypt in 1799. On 9th through 10th November, the government was overthrown and effective power passed into the hands of the Corsican general. Outside France, the intellectual repercussions of the French Revolution were most marked in Germany. The revolutionary ideas changed their quality when refracted through North German society, where the Lutheran Church had remained in very close contact with the educated middle class as a whole, and a strong Pietist tradition had throughout the century stressed the moral improvement of the individual rather than the bonheur of society as a whole, as the goal of political action. German writers tended to see the revolution as a primarily moral phenomenon. Many of them began by welcoming what they interpreted as a repudiation of the dissolute morals and arbitrary politics of the old order. Kant, who supported the revolution to the end of his life, wrote in 1798 that it had, quote, discovered in the depths of human nature a possibility of moral progress, whose presence no statesman had hitherto suspected, end quote. He saw it as the political demonstration of his philosophy of freedom, as willing surrender to the law one has imposed on oneself. More common was the view that the revolution had brought France to a pitch of moral responsibility, which already existed in Germany. Intellectuals showed little tendency to react in a nationalist way when French armies defeated German ones. As late as 1799, Fichte wrote, quote, only the French Republic can be considered by a just man as his true country. On its victory depend the dearest hopes and even the very existence of humanity, end quote. Disillusionment with the terror, however, led to a widespread tendency to withdraw from political commitment into the more congenial realms of abstraction. Schiller maintained that the French people, corrupted by the Enlightenment, were incapable of submitting to the rule of reason. Government must therefore continue to rest on force until education should bring humanity to a higher level of political morality. The general tendency was to revert to the doctrine that the state was entitled to political obedience so long as it left education, religion, and matters of conscience to the individual. As the publicist Gentz expressed it in 1801, quote, whoever obeys just laws is already free and cannot become more free, end quote. It would be an oversimplification rather than a caricature to say that the lesson most German thinkers derived from the French Revolution was the comforting one that political action was unnecessary, if not actually irrelevant to freedom. Liberty was something within the individual himself, not a matter of franchises and political machinery. The policies of the rulers were determined as much by local conditions and diplomatic rivalries as by ideological considerations. Catherine of Russia, whose, quote, enlightenment, end quote, had been largely a matter of public relations, had already been badly frightened by Pugachev's peasant revolt in 1773-75, which had produced a court reaction against the influence of the philosophers over an increasingly French educated nobility. A strict censorship of the press was imposed as early as 1790, and the number of books published in Russia fell from 439 to 1788, to 165 in 1797. When Radishev published his criticism of Russian society, a journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, in 1790, Catherine exploded in marginal denunciations of his, quote, French mania, end quote, before packing him off to Siberia. Catherine and Frederick William II of Prussia both affected to regard the Polish Constitution of 1791 as spreading the revolutionary contagion into Eastern Europe. The Empress may possibly have seen things in this light, but both of them were perhaps mainly concerned to find a pretext for a second partition of Poland, and Catherine, at least, had little use for principles that did not pay high political dividends. She withdrew her ambassador from Paris in 1791, severed all trade relations with France on the execution of Louis XVI, and expelled all Frenchmen who had not taken oath against the revolution. The only thing she did not do was provide any military support for Austria and Prussia in their war against France. Charity began, if not at home, at least in Poland, most of which she succeeded in annexing. The reactions of the German rulers were considerably more complicated. In the case of both Prussia and Austria, it is impossible to say how far changes of policy were due simply to the personalities of new monarchs. The minor German princes, who had long been accustomed to the direct dictation of outside influences, tried to continue on their opportunist way. The payment of a war indemnity in France in 1796 forced the Duke of Württemberg to summon his estates for the first time since 1770. 3 years later, he profited from the advance of Allied armies to recover his autocratic powers. In each case, the revolution was the occasion, rather than the cause of a new swing in an old pendulum. In both of the two main states, there were bureaucrats who saw that the revolution had a good deal in common with their own centralizing, rationalizing, and anti-aristocratic policies. This was most obvious in Prussia, where a minister claimed in 1791 that her new constitution gave France a system of government similar to that of Prussia. And Struensee wrote in 1799, quote, "The salutary revolution which you made from below upward will happen in Prussia slowly from above downward. The king is a democrat in his own way. He is continually working to limit the privileges of the nobility," end quote. The Prussian establishment does not seem to have felt itself ideologically threatened. In 1795, Prussia withdrew from the war and remained neutral for the next 11 years. The Habsburgs, as usual, found their political options much less simple. In 1789, the Belgian provinces were in open revolt and Hungary on the verge of rebellion, for reasons that had no direct connection with the situation in France. It was perhaps for basically Austrian reasons that Joseph II abolished freedom of the press and developed his secret police in the same year. Leopold II, who succeeded him in 1790, infuriated his sister, Marie Antoinette, by his reluctance to join any crusade to rescue the French monarchy. This was scarcely surprising, since he wrote to another sister, quote, "I am convinced that the executive power belongs to the sovereign, while the legislative power belongs to the people and its representatives," end quote. He was in fact hoping to use popular representation as a means of curbing the resistance of the nobility to royal absolutism. When Leopold was in turn succeeded by Francis II in 1792, Austrian policies changed, partly because the new king allowed himself to be drawn into war with France. The loss of the Netherlands by 1794 prevented the Austrians from extricating themselves from the war as easily as Prussia. War increased the political importance of the nobility, and the new king's policies were appreciably more conservative than those of his predecessor. Josephist ministers and civil servants were dismissed. The death penalty for treason was restored, with up to 10 years. Imprisonment for impudent public criticism of the government. Genuine, if not very dangerous, revolutionary plots were discovered. They had no connection with France, and 7 of the leaders were executed. Even so, courageous advocates of the rule of law prevented the creation of special tribunals to judge political offenders, and check the purge of suspected teachers and clergy. The gains of the Enlightenment were not wholly lost in Vienna, and counter-revolutionary theorists who hoped to use the revolution as the occasion for a holy war against the 18th century, in all its works, found the monarchs and those who named they were campaigning rather a disappointment. The British government had less to fear from the revolution than most, since it was already more or less responsible to an elected assembly of sorts. The French claimed that the gentlemen should be treated like gentilshommes, pose no very serious threat to the fabric of British society. The Paris embassy was apprehensive lest the revolution should at last provide the national enemy with an efficient government, and Burke used it as a peg on which to hang his attack on most of the principles of the Enlightenment. But the initial British reaction was largely favorable. With the outbreak of war, however, men had to choose sides. Those who continued to support the revolution were the advocates of radical reform at home, and in both capacities they frightened the government. Sooner or later, most of the intellectuals turned against the revolution. The poets changed sides. Burns quite early, Coleridge soon, after the outbreak of war, and Wordsworth a good deal later. Only Blake remained true to his earlier convictions, protecting himself by deeper and deeper obscurity. Arthur Young, who had been very sympathetic when he was in France in 1789, was looking for Jacobins under his bed by 1793, when he wrote, "The example of France was a warning to Britain." Quote, where the licentiousness of the press is in any degree allowed, the general instruction of the lower classes must become the seat of revolt. And it is for this reason that the friends of reform and zealous admirers of French equality are strenuous for Sunday and charity schools. End quote. In Britain, where there is no tradition of conflict between a reforming bureaucracy and a privileged nobility, the tendency to equate the revolution with enlightenment, popular education, and religious skepticism was perhaps stronger than on the continent. There was a curious tendency to panic and a general rallying around a frightened government which had few scruples about abrogating the constitutional liberties it claimed to be defending. The Treasonable Practices Act, the Seditious Meetings Act, the suspicion of habeas corpus, and the widespread use of police informers were all moves in the direction of a police state. The forces of order were too well knit to have much to fear from the London Corresponding Society and similar radical groups. When a real revolt broke out in Ireland in 1798, the government threw in 140,000 troops, which was considerably more than it had ever thought necessary against Napoleon. By 1794, the French Republic was beginning to take the military offensive, and the relationship between the Revolution and the old order became less one-sided. The Republicans never succeeded in making a definite choice between a conventional policy of strengthening French frontiers by annexing strategic territories and an ideological one of protecting the country's borders by a chain of sister republics under French supervision. So you have to forgive me as I yawn sometimes. That means that I'm probably going to take a break from reading and I come back in and read some more. It's tiring work reading books, you know. Okay. So, where was this? Yeah, so vacillating between the two and alienating opinion in the liberated areas by making them pay heavily for the privilege. The French government could neither make a lasting compromise peace with Austria nor set off a revolutionary movement outside France that was capable of standing on its own feet. Nevertheless, its tortuous and sometimes self-defeating policies were to have an important, and in some cases a permanent influence over a long strip of territory stretching from the North Sea to the Adriatic. The first step was taken in 1792, when Savoy and Nice were annexed to France, after local plebiscites, which, in the case of Savoy at least, may well have expressed the real wishes of the more articulate inhabitants. In 1795, Belgium was also annexed. The territories concerned were accustomed to being administered from relatively distant capitals, and while the clergy and nobility had little to hope from incorporation in the French Republic, merchants and important Belgian manufacturers had much to gain from access to French markets. French progress elsewhere was due to a combination of military pressure and local support. In Holland, the Rhineland, and North Italy were disaffected minorities in the towns who would welcome an opportunity to eject the ruling patricians, even at the price of French military occupation. This was especially the case in Holland, where the unrest of the 1780s had produced a substantial crop of exiles, many of them settled in France. In this sense, one can perhaps speak of a democratic movement, operating over a good deal of West Europe. but scarcely of a democratic revolution, since the revolutionaries were nowhere strong enough to seize power without the support of the French army. Indeed, it is something of a misnomer to refer to them as Democrats when one of their main problems was precisely the absence of active mass support for the policies which they believed to be in the general interest. There is a good deal to be said for the contemporary term Jacobins, which was generally taken to mean egalitarian Republicans who were confident that public opinion would eventually endorse policies that it was too ignorant to appreciate at the time of their adoption. The problem facing the foreign Jacobins was not the seizure of power. That was relatively easy. When the approach of a French army induced a general sauve-qui-peut, but once installed as the protégés of the occupying force, they were liable to incur their share of the unpopularity that went with military requisitioning and exceptional taxation. To safeguard themselves, they were then obliged to press for annexation by France in the Netherlands and in northern Italy. After the invasion of Bonaparte's army in 1796, there was enough local support to bring more or less viable republics into being. Even here, however, the Directory intervened from time to time to keep the sister republics aligned with revolutionary orthodoxy, as defined in Paris. Since French politics were continually zigzagging between royalism and the extreme republicanism of 1793 through 94, the consequences in the French dependencies were somewhat disconcerting. Interference from Paris and the exactions of generals and tax collectors prevented the two republics from acquiring much prestige in their own right. In 1798, the pressure of events, rather than deliberate policy in Paris, led to the creation of new republics in Rome, Naples, and Switzerland. The Italian republics of 1798 rested on very weak foundations, and there was a serious popular revolt in Naples. When general war resumed in 1799, Switzerland and all the other southern satellites were immediately threatened. Despite their checkered and sometimes inglorious careers, the sister republics were the scene of radical changes that left permanent traces, to a greater or lesser degree. French institutions were copied in them all. Archaic forms of administration were replaced by centralization on the French pattern, operating through departments of the French type. Where the Netherlands and Switzerland were concerned in an annexed Belgium, the destruction of the old feudal structure was to prove permanent. Social equality, as established in France by the session of the 4th of August 1789, was enforced in Belgium and the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent in Switzerland and northern Italy. A judicial system based on the French model was similarly introduced, with local variations. In some republics, the property of the church was confiscated and sold. In Italy, the Cisalpine Republic refused to recognize the validity of religious vows and introduced civil marriage. Everywhere except in the Netherlands, the emergence of a relatively free press implied a sharp break with tradition. In Switzerland, 84 newspapers appeared between 1798 and 1803. There were 30 in Milan alone. The old order, based on habit, traditional practice, and indifference, and on the self-perpetuating rule of privileged cliques, gave way to bustling innovation, an active political life, and a competition for power among men who were younger, more dynamic, and committed to change. The new ideas sometimes took the form of old dreams. In the Cisalpine Republic, a movement for Italian unification became sufficiently pronounced to attract the attention of the French authorities, who tried to suppress it. When Napoleon seized power in France, therefore, much had already been done to implant revolutionary institutions of the French type beyond the borders of the Grand Nation. Okay, yeah, so that was the name of this title. The title of this chapter was, it's quite a long one compared to the other ones, but I think its real length was pictures. It seems longer. Was so I'm still flipping through pages. A lot of cool pictures in this book. The French Revolution and the European Reaction. That's what it said here. Okay. And so next is going to be the Indian Summer of Enlightened Despotism, which should be a good read as well. And, yeah, so Yeah, the Indian summer of enlightened despotism will be next. So thank y'all for tuning in. Reading about bourgeois revolutions here on Marxist Law. This is you can follow me Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Tumblr, TikTok, Medium. All of these are Marxist Law. Hit me up there. Y'all have a great day and Dadagoy.